Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high income earners come to learn wealth building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into today's episode of the Money Insights Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Allen. With me, as always, or at least most of the time, is Rodney the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, what's going on, my friend?
Hey, I am doing great. How are you?
I couldn't be better, Rod, because today we're going to talk about why cash flow is king, and I love talking about cash flow.
Yes.
So for that reason, I couldn't be any better. It's one of my favorite topics. And can I just tell you, it's one of our audience's favorite topics too. And that's why we're going to really nail it today. Before we get into it though, Rod, any important updates? I mean, I feel like our audience, we owe it to our audience to give any Zabriskie family updates that are important so that we can keep everybody in tune with what's going on with the Fab Nine.
Man, I wish
Zabriskies.
I wish I could remember where we left off, but I'm a grandpa again. I don't know if I
holy smokes. See, that's a big deal. See, I'm glad I feel like I don't feel like that cat was let out of the bag yet.
Okay.
If
so
it was
had her second child.
Okay. Well, if it was, it doesn't hurt to give another congrats and another shout out to Julianne, who helps us out from time to time. So that's exciting. And do you feel old?
Well, I do.
You look young,
older and older
Rod.
every day.
Young.
So yeah.
Okay, well, I'm wondering if I'm even going to be a grandpa at this point in my life. Right? My kids, they're cut from their very own unique cloth. So we'll just see how that.
It's still early to say, right?
Yeah, no, it is. It is. It absolutely is. Anything could happen. So there's no question they could hit that, that instinctual, parental feeling that comes to most of us as we get older. So I'm crossing my fingers that that's the case, but I have a feeling, Rod, it's probably not going to be as early as you were. Just saying. That's just a guess. Okay.
Maybe.
Well, let's get into our topic, shall we?
Sweet. Let's do it.
What the heck is cash flow? I know this is an easy and obvious starting point, but I do think that some people can, especially if you're if you haven't spent a lot of time in this world, it sounds really obvious, and maybe it is, but let's just make sure that there's no question as to what we're describing or what we're talking about when we say cash flow.
Yeah. So basically we're saying that there are different ways, different goals that you could have in mind when you invest. And one of them could be just to grow an asset, right? So someone, whatever, they buy a piece of property because they think, hey, this is going to later be an interstate interchange and people are going to be vying for this land. I want to buy it and hold it for the next 20 years. That is not likely to create a lot of cash flow because it's just all about the appreciation. You're just putting your kind of chips on the table and saying, I think that's gonna grow, and it's more about appreciation. We're talking about investing in things that create income that turns into positive cash flow so that your income exceeds any expenses that you have. So you have a net positive, it doesn't have to be necessarily on a month-to-month basis, but over the course of a year, you have more coming in than you're putting out, positive cash flow coming into your world.
Okay, so I like that you emphasize the idea of positive cash flow, because I do think we take that for granted. We just say, oh, what's the cash flow? And we're saying, what's the positive cash flow, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it's important because there is a difference at some level. So we want to make sure that we're really clear on what we're talking about. So thanks for clarifying, Rod. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to talk about why cash flow is so valuable, so important, why cash flow is king. Mm-hmm. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, maybe I can start with my own starting point.
Let's do it.
Which, as in talking to a lot of people, it's a lot of people's starting point.
All right, so let's hear yours. Oh, wait, are you going to tell a story?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about when I was in college.
Yeah, dude, I want to hear it. Tell us.
And I've been thinking recently about how, who put that book in front of me, and I have no idea. I don't
No idea.
remember how that happened.
Okay, was it the cash flow quadrant or?
Okay, first it was Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was checking. I couldn't remember
Rich Dad,
which
Poor
one
Dad.
you got first. Rich
But
Dad, Poor Dad.
then if I'm really saying, okay, what book had the most impact on me, then it was the Cash Flow Quadrant, because principles in Rich Dad Poor Dad were helpful and useful and sometimes kind of scary, because he told his own experience about he and his wife living in their car because they tried and failed and whatever. So, but good, right? Because that's the reality of it. It is a struggle to get to the place where you really want to be. But anyway, long story short, Cash Flow Quadrant, I would say, was more impactful because that's where he breaks out and he says, there's a huge difference between being an employee versus being self-employed versus being a business owner or being an investor. And there are a lot of differences that he talked about in that book. It's a lot thicker book than Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really came away with was, I want to create passive streams of income that will eventually replace my working income. Basically, make me financially free in the sense that it's on my terms.
Yeah, and again, like the idea that you can step away from any active working activities and just know that I've got stuff coming in, like that is kind of like, let's face it, that's kind of the American dream.
Yeah.
And if you learn how to build these cash flow streams, it becomes a situation where you don't have to worry about running out of money, right? Mm-hmm. The same way that I have that concern if I build up a pot of money and I decide I'm going to stop working and I'm going to rely on that limited pot. Because what's happening when you're creating cash flow, like you're literally continuing to create and earn and build upon that pot. And of course, if you're good at it, like for a lot of people, they get into that phase and they continue to build beyond what they need. And then they're just building their net worth and feeding that bank as it continues to grow. And that's like literally what creates generational wealth. And from my perspective, that's the starting point, at least from a goals perspective, as to where people should be looking when they want financial freedom.
And I think that's a great point, because earlier I was distinguishing between investing for appreciation versus investing for cash flow. But most often, not always, but a lot of times when you're investing, even though the primary goal is the cash flow, you still have an appreciating asset in a lot of cases. And so you're doing both.
Right. So you think about the most common things that we think about creating cash flow. Let's say that it's rental income from some sort of property.
Yeah.
Like that underlying property, we have a long history of suggesting that the real estate market continues to go up and up. And again, like one of the nice things here is you're also getting the opportunity to utilize leverage. So now you're utilizing leverage to create appreciation on an asset, which is, potentially creating a much larger return than what you're getting, than what the asset's actually appreciating. Meanwhile, and again, this is like best case scenario. Meanwhile, you're throwing cash off of it at the same time. But here's the good news. Like you can absolutely do that, and people do it every single day.
Yeah.
It's not like this is some crazy pie in the sky idea. You just have to be kind of committed to the idea. And of course, the more you keep feeding it, the more powerful it gets. And you just get to the point where like you're literally doing things on your own terms. Now, when you're working because you want to, not because you have to. And that's like, that feels really good. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I know we all often talk about real estate in this example. I want to turn it to like business.
No,
so for example,
only real estate on this podcast. Just kidding, Rod. That's been the biggest place. Like I've frequently said the best place, the most effective place to build wealth quickly is through a business, right?
Yeah.
Like there's almost no question that's true. Okay, keep going.
And we almost always talk about your own business, because getting into some of the points of what we're bringing up here, that's where you have more control, more say, more drive that you can add to it to make it go where you want it to go. And yet, if we're also talking about financial freedom, then at some point we have to be able to work our way out. I'm going to say out, but let's clarify
or
that.
at least
More on
become
your own
like more
terms.
hands off. Yeah, do it. That's a good way to say it. You're doing it on your own terms.
If you want to keep working, it's because you want to. So I was talking to a good friend last night. He's a listener of the podcast, and
shout out.
We've known each other since college. That's where we met.
Cool.
And he is a partner in an engineering company. And basically his comment to me was, I have to figure out a way to get out of this. Right. Not because he's like feeling trapped, but because he's feeling like, I don't want to always be filling the role I'm filling now. I want to get to a place where I can have a little more freedom, leeway, become more of a mentor instead of an operator. Right. And so that is a challenge for any business owner, right? How do I get to a place where I can, kind of monetize it in a sense, right? Make it so I can step away from a financial standpoint, but also from an operational standpoint. What are the steps that have to, and it's a process, right? It's going to be a process for him. But I guess my point is, when he gets to that place where he wants to be, he's that mentor role. There's been value that has changed hands, so to speak. But to the extent that he still owns a part of the business and is still receiving income as a part of that business, well, that's cash flow, right? That's something that he doesn't have to work every day to make it happen. He's built a system, a process where other people come to work every day, create value, and he gets to partake in that value because of the ownership that he has in that business, even though he's not going to be having to show up every day. Right.
And it's one of the tried and true ways to get wealthy.
Yes.
It just is. It's one of the like some people, obviously you can become an investor in a startup tech company and knock it out of the park. But that's like, there's an element of luck involved in that, for most likely. This is tried and true, right? What you're talking about is tried and true. It can be difficult, but it's an incredibly worthwhile pursuit, because once that you've done that, you've created a level of freedom that you couldn't do in really, most other ways that you were building wealth.
Yeah, for sure. And we don't want to ignore the opportunity that you could have to invest in someone else's business like that, right? So I always go back to Shark Tank on this one, just because so I have so many examples of
Well, of course we love Damon.
Yep, that's right. He's our man. And there are a lot of situations where, when they invest in the company, it is to create, like, part of their negotiation is when you take distributions, I get distributions, right? If I'm going to own this, whatever, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, then we all get those distributions, and that's powerful, right? They do want to grow the business, of course.
Yes.
But they're also still focusing on value that I can get out of it that's more immediate than,
how do I get my money back? How am I going to get my money back, Rod? That's Mr. Wonderful. He wants to know how he's going to get his money back. Yeah. So he loves cash flow.
Royalties. Cash flow. Yeah, he'll
loves
do
royalties. Anything he can get his hands on, he's all about cash flow.
Yep.
Okay, so just to be really clear and make a few points. Some of the reasons that cash flow is king. First of all, obviously you're creating consistent income that can get you to financial independence, and again, a tried and true way. So that's number one. The second one, we've hit on this in a lot of ways, but that's just like having both flexibility and control over the how, when, why, where, all of those elements that are typically out of our control when we come into this, like, the cash flow quadrant world. And if we can get ourselves into the business owner, and especially being able to step out, then we've created like a significant amount of control over and flexibility over those things. And even while we're building the flexibility, at least we have the control to make the decisions that are right for us along the way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we're not relying on the whims of other people that could have a really big impact on what our financial world looks like. The other reason is that, and this is one we haven't talked about as much, is there's protection against typical market volatility, right? So you think about rents. When the markets go up and down, rents typically don't go up and down like that, right? Rents typically go up. They typically don't go down, right? So like and again, you have to be thoughtful in the way that this is put together, but for the most part, rents just go up. So even if the market's tank, the S&P 500 is down 10, 20, 30%, like that's not going to have the same impact on it if we were using, for example, the traditional model where all of our money is in qualified plans and things like that are almost certainly tied to, market indexes and that kind of thing. So It's just a really big differentiation in terms of our ability to create protection against just general market volatility. I have a couple more, Rod.
Okay.
You have the peace of mind and the quality of life that you want, right? So there's just this element of knowing it's coming and knowing that I've got oftentimes a physical asset. Doesn't have to be, I guess, like notes can be powerful too. But like when I initially think of it, I think about, real estate and self-storage and like those kind of oftentimes physical assets. But like when I think of those, I think there is a huge amount of stability, which creates peace of mind. And again, this is like directly correlated to, this idea of not being tied to market up and downs. But it's also different just in the sense that when you can create that peace of mind, it just like naturally creates the quality of life that you want. I think about my quality of life has less to do with the amount of money in my bank account, and it has a lot more to do with the level of anxiety and stress that I feel, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I think of that, I'm like, it genuinely is a way to create a peace of mind knowing that I've got a physical asset oftentimes that's creating cash flow that's not going to be tied to the markets. It's going to be coming in and month out. That's powerful.
For sure. And one thing that we have maybe not talked about in much detail so far is we're not removing risk, right? There's risk in anything that we choose to do. You can't get away from it. But kind of what I hear you saying is it's measured risk. It's doing it in a way that you can, both diversify, right? Because we're suggesting that you have multiple streams of income, multiple sources of your cash flow. Because if you choose just one, well, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. That's dangerous, right? Because go back to the rental. Sometimes people move out, and you're going to be without rent for a period of time. So if it's hopefully not just one unit, if you're in real estate, hopefully it's a bunch of units. So you diversify in that way, but then diversifying in a variety of different asset types, different risk profiles, so that even if you're struggling in one area, which people have been over the last couple of years with, say, multifamily as an example, if you were relying on a syndication for cash flow where it wasn't just your own kind of rental income, and that went away, in some cases, the whole investment went belly up, you should have, the goal is to have other places, multiple ways that you're getting that, so that you don't lose the stream of income. That's the whole point, right? You don't have that quality of life and peace of mind if you're overly reliant on just a single source or just a couple of sources.
Yeah, I totally agree. I saw a post the other day and it said it was on LinkedIn. It said something to the effect of investing in a single syndication won't bring you financial independence, right? Like, I know that's like obvious, but sometimes people get in this idea that it's like, okay, if I can just invest in something, then I'll be okay. Like, but it is a continuous thing, right? You've got to continually build, you've got to continually be investing, continually be creating streams of income, because the more streams of income you have, the more freedom, flexibility, peace of mind, quality of life, right? All of those things come together when you've got diversification, because to your point, things are going to happen. Like, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And so if I know that things are going to happen, well, I can prepare for that. Unfortunately, too many people don't. And that's where things can become a little bit choppy. So to your point, cash flow is king, but do it through multiple sources, not just one.
Yeah. Conceptually, what we're saying is it's pretty simple idea, right? But we don't want to make it feel so simplistic that we don't really think it through and do it in the right way.
Yeah. Okay. There's one more point I want to talk about before we get into some of kind of the core strategies for building cash flows. So the first thing I want to hit on, or the last thing I want to hit on, is the impact of being able to create wealth transfer. So again, I'm going to go back to real estate because that's the most common thing that I think about. I realize that there's other things that create cash flow, but that's probably the most common one. Is that at least fair? Okay. Yep. So most often you've got a physical piece of real estate or a physical asset that's underlying in what's creating the cash flow that's coming off of it. Well, real estate is one of the best vehicles from a wealth transfer standpoint because it gets what they call step up in basis. And if you've listened to us, you probably already know what that is. But for those who have not, step up in basis just means that at my death, let's say that I own a piece of property. At my death, that property now is valued at the price that it was at the time of my death. So when my family gets it, they're not paying some big capital gains bill. Let's say that they immediately sell it at that price. Well, there is going to be zero capital gains. I've talked about how my grandpa passed about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and I got some inheritance from that, and it was completely free and clear because the value, even though he bought those fourplexes for like, oh my gosh, pennies on the dollar for what they're worth now, we had it free and clear. And so that's a really powerful wealth transfer vehicle, not to mention that all along the way that was creating for my grandparents, that was creating a consistent cash flow that really allowed them, by the way, to do, they're a great example. They traveled the world. My grandma's favorite place was Hawaii. She'd been there 17 times, but they had been to like 83 countries and they just were traveling like crazy. And they did it because they owned these real estate properties that just provided them consistent, continual cash flow. They didn't have to worry about money. It just became like a really simple, easy way of life. And it's because, again, my grandpa made that a priority early. Yeah. And it paid off like in a really meaningful way and really across the board, right? Because not only did it create those cash flows and the peace of mind and quality of life for him, it also did what I'm talking about here. It was a really powerful legacy vehicle it gave to like his kids, and it passed on to me because my parents had already passed. But like it was, it really came full circle and did all the things that we're talking about here. So anyway, okay, Rod,
it's good planning right there.
Yeah, it was good planning, right?
Good planning on his part. And so he got more of what he wanted, which was the cash flow, and he wanted more to go to his heirs, right? He didn't want as much to be eaten up in taxes and things like that. And so, man, doing it the right way.
Crazy thing, Rod. Crazy story. My grandpa flirted with selling these maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Okay. And he ended up deciding not to do it. He certainly could have still. It was a weird situation though. There was just a really, and I don't know if you'll remember this, but there was like a small plane that was going over, I can't remember which lake, but it was going somewhere and it crash landed. The 3 or 4 people that were in it all passed away. Like horrible situation, really sad. Those people were the people buying my grandpa's properties.
Oh, interesting.
And they like already they were moving through under contract, but it obviously didn't go through after that happened. So then he decided not to do it. Anyway, just kind of a side note story, kind of crazy. Okay, Rod, now what I want to do is I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the core strategies for building wealth. Let's start with the most obvious. And why don't you kind of kick us off with that?
Yeah. So we've been talking about real estate in more general terms. Let's get a little more specific. So in the real estate world, there obviously you can have rental properties, which typically include duplexes, triplexes, multifamily, once you get into the larger places. Commercial real estate, man, I tell you what, when we owned the spa and we were signing on the lease, well, the lease was already set, right, from the previous owner. We were just kind of taking it over, but renegotiating terms with them. And the way that
didn't go very well, by the way.
No, when I look at those contracts and the landlord pays nothing in the expenses. Which you might say, well, of course not. If they're not receiving any income, then they don't. But no, they weren't paying any of them. Basically, what happened is we had our payments that we would pay on a monthly basis, and then we would get a true up each year where they would say, hey, it turns out whatever, we paid more for snow removal than we had budgeted, and we paid more in property taxes, and we had more whatever, this or that. So you guys owe us more money because you're paying that, we're not. And I was like, I got to get in on that.
That's a sweet deal,
man. That just is
sweet
amazing.
gig, man. Yeah, no, you're right.
So,
It was a pretty good deal for them. So that's a good one.
Yeah.
So real estate is like the one we talk about. It just is what comes to people's mind, but it's certainly not the only one. There's a bunch of ways that we can build cash flow. What else you got, Rod?
Well, businesses we talked about could be your own. You built it, you're stepping away, but you still have ownership in it, so you receive from that. But it could be other businesses that you invest in, and it could even be, like dividends, right? So investing in a business as much for the appreciation, maybe in place of like thinking about only about appreciation, investing it for dividends can create that as well, right? So business on a lot of different levels.
I'll throw a few in here. So you talked about businesses. I in the spirit of fairness, Rod, I always talk about we want to have the best of the traditional and the best of the alternative. So I'm going to bring in some of the more traditional ways. Dividend paying stocks, obviously, is a way that you can create cash flow, right? And there actually are some really strong, like some great stocks that have a really incredible history of just paying consistent cash flow. So like that's certainly something that can be a way to do it. REITs is one, right? A REIT is a real estate investment trust. It's kind of like a hybrid, right? You can and you can have publicly traded REITs, you can have private REITs. So there's different ways that can work. But either way, REITs are typically an investment that's focused specifically on cash flow. Notes and like private lending. I was actually telling someone, we had a question in the live webinar yesterday about ways that you could use the investment optimizer strategy, right? So we're talking about how to invest through high cash value life insurance to boost returns. And someone asked the question like, would this work if I was like lending money? And I remembered a specific client that we had from years ago who's been doing it for a long time. And anyway, lots of people have a lot of success doing that. So that's another one. Royalties, Rod. We talked about Mr. Wonderful. He loves royalties. Royalties are a great way to. Now that's always, that's more on like, that can be like franchise ownership, or it could be like, when I think of royalties, I think of if you're like an artist and you know what I mean, or if you're that kind of thing, but any intellectual property where that is where that fits.
Yeah. And that's where like in Shark Tank, it's amazing how the mood changes when someone says they own a patent, because now when you're investing in that business, it's not just the business, it's that intellectual property that comes with it. Yeah.
That's a really great point. Another one that's coming to mind, Rod, equipment leasing. We've been talking about this recently as we had David Perez on the show. Equipment leasing, that specific strategy that he's offering is very much a cash flow play. Covered call options, Rod. This isn't one that I've ever played in, but it is very much a way to create cash flow. Farmland and agriculture. Now, that's a little like you usually think about farmland just for appreciation, but if you're actually like doing something on the farmland, right? Then you could very much, like if you're renting it out for someone else to farm, as an example, that could very much be a way to do it. One, Rod, that typically people don't think about until they're much older as a cash flow source is things like annuities. Annuities are a vehicle that's meant to create cash flow for the rest of our life. We call it income for life, right? But at the end of the day, it's really the same thing. It's creating a cash flow that you can't outlive. Oil and gas is another one, right? So anyway, my point really is to say that there are a myriad of ways to create cash flows. So like, even if you don't necessarily love the idea of investing in real estate properties, maybe you don't like the idea of even owning physical assets because of the extra work that could come with that. Like there are a lot of opportunities that you could go and find cash flow situations that don't necessarily involve those things. So like, it's kind of one of those things where you can go in whatever investment direction you want to and still, create cash flows, regardless of whether you're staying in the traditional or the alternative space. Although I will say this, the alternative space as a whole is much better at creating the combination of cash flow appreciation and tax benefits,
Yeah.
that's kind of not even close. But again, there's opportunities regardless of which end of the spectrum you stand on.
Agreed.
Okay, so before we move on from talking specifically about ways to create cash flow, Rod, we can't forget to talk about high cash value life insurance and the role that the investment optimizer plays. Why don't you run us through why that's so powerful and why it's part of the cash flow equation?
Yeah. Well, it over time, it'll serve a couple of different roles because the whole point of using the investment optimizer is to enhance the returns and benefits you get off of the investments that you're doing. So including cash flow, right?
So number one is it's just like everything that you do, you run it through there and it increases the return. So in that way, it's just helping you improve the cash flows.
Yes. Higher levels of cash flow than you otherwise would have had if you didn't use the investment optimizer. Okay. So that's number one. And then there's what we call phase two. So you've done a lot of investing through the policy in the investment optimizer strategy. Now you're at a place where we've talked about where it's kind of things on your own terms. You're now relying more on the cash flow from your investments for your income, right? Mm-hmm. I'm avoiding saying retirement because so many people that we work with don't like that word in the traditional sense of the way Americans use it.
Well, but our wording, Rod, even when we get into retirement, we use retirement cash flow.
Yes.
So it just makes sense.
Flow. Yep, exactly. So now you're at that stage and you have a whole bunch of money that you've now built up inside of your life insurance policy. And that too can be used to create a source of tax-free cash flow coming to you and can last the rest of your life. It's very consistent, reliable source of that cash flow.
Well, okay. So you think about it. Let's talk about like whole life insurance, just to kind of create this consistency model. We think about things that can create cash flow, right? Now, we're not. Let's not even talk about the leverage or any of those other elements. We won't even hit on the tax benefit. But let's just say. Well, actually, let me back up. It's important to remember whole life insurance builds cash in two ways, right? It's guaranteed interest rate. So that's not going anywhere. I like the consistency that comes with the guarantee. And then the second part is the dividends. And we hit on this every time we talk about it because it's just like such a big deal. Mm-hmm. We're talking about 175 years of every single year paying a dividend. So this is like really, really important to these companies. Like it would really have to hit the fan for a company to be like, I'm just not paying any dividends, right? Yep. So like we see a little bit of fluctuation in dividends as like market conditions adjust, but it's ultra consistent. Like you can, like we've talked about for the last, 15 years, we've been talking about getting 5+% return in our cash value, in our whole life policies. Mm-hmm. Again, has to be built the correct way, but if it's built for maximum cash, minimum cost, I'm getting that. And that's been through like one of the most difficult, let's call this one of the lowest interest rate, maybe the lowest interest rate time frame the country's ever seen. Yeah. And you think about like life insurance cash or specifically dividend. Let me try that again. Yes, dividends from the insurance company, those are at least somewhat based on general interest rates. So my point really, all of that is just to say like it's an ultra consistent form of cash flow.
Yeah, for sure. And this isn't even to speak, we haven't even talked about the capital avalanche, right?
We should talk about that.
And that one is specifically built for creating tax-free cash flow in retirement.
Yeah, and you're utilizing all the same principles that you do with real estate. You're utilizing leverage in the very same way. We always go at the conservative leverage because there's no outside collateral like you typically see with premium finance designs. We love the idea that it's conservative enough that it's like self-enclosed because there's just a safety net that exists there, right? We always have the net equity in the policy. But just by just that strategy, Rod, like I've said it, I always say it's the most powerful way to create tax-free income that I've ever seen. That's why I do it myself. And that's why we teach people, like especially high income earners, that it's a really great source, especially if you're trying to create the tax benefits that are so difficult to get when you phase out of Roth IRAs and things like that. You know what I mean?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, let's finish by talking about some practical steps that are high income earning audience can do right now to start actually building up cash flows, where do they start?
You begin by assessing where you are in time.
You start at the beginning, Rod. You start at the beginning. You have to know where you're at in order to know where you're going. Okay, sorry. I took your thunder there. My bad.
No, that's great. I liked it. And so it's looking where you are now and then looking at where you want to be, right? What do your cash flow goals need to be in order to make it happen? And I'll tell you, if you're thinking about, well, okay, I know where I am now, that's the easy part, but in creating a goal of where I want to be, I mean, focus on expenses and then adjust it for inflation. And if you're saying my goal is to have enough passive cash flow to replace my working cash flow in 10 years or whatever that number is, adjust for inflation and then see what that number is. And then I would say even maybe go a little higher. We talked about having multiple sources, factoring in risk that exists. And so just as part of that, if my number, again, I'll just throw out a number. What if my number was whatever, $100,000 to cover my regular expenses? That's my baseline. Well, maybe I would double that to say, well, I actually really want to travel like your grandparents did, or have other things that are a priority that not just covering my most basic needs. And so my goal in my hypothetical example is to have 200,000 adjusted for inflation for 10 years from now. And so it might be really 250 or something like that, right?
I like it, Rod. You're bringing in the outside factors. You're not leaving this for chance. You know what those goals are. I like it, Rod. A goal that's like too generic is usually not a goal at all. So I like it. You got to get specific and understanding what those cash flow goals are. Okay, once we've done that, Rod, once we've followed step one, we know where we're at. We've set our cash flow goals. The next step is we've got to actually explore investment options. That's where we go up to those like 10, 12, however many things that we just rattled off. Mm-hmm. Like we start to explore opportunities that we can take advantage of, which will create cash flow. And we align those with our other like investment objectives, right? Yes. So again, there's a lot of ways to create cash flow. Not all of them are going to appeal to everybody. So you're going to find the ones that fit who you are. They make the most sense. They feel the most comfortable. You understand them. And then that's the thing that you kind of lock in on and start to focus. And the next, you've got to become educated, right?
Yes.
So this is where I did a post this week, Rod, and so it said something like passive income isn't passive at all. Mm-hmm. And it's because I always think about this idea, like, I don't know, like alternative investments aren't really alternative at all. And passive investing isn't really passive at all. And like, but it's just a whole big mess, right? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. My point is just to say, Rod, there's a lot of different opportunities for cash flow investing. We've got to make sure we know what we're doing, when we're doing it, how we're doing it. But more than anything, the way to do that is to become educated and understand what's out there. Again, when we find what we like, we dig in a little bit deeper, and then we actually have to pull the trigger, Rod. You got to do it. You got to save, make sure that you have money. You got to put it in a cash flow investment. You've got to find a cash flow opportunity. It won't work if you don't do that, I promise.
Yep. And can I say this as well? You don't necessarily have to create all of the cash flow now if your goal is to be 10 years from now able to do that. You might still focus on some things that are a little more appreciation heavy, knowing that money needs to free up between now and the timing of your goal, so then you can move that money into more cash flow friendly things, right?
So Rod, guess what? I took the investor quiz this morning. Okay. I was doing a run through to make sure the website was running. So I took the investor quiz. Do you have any idea what type of investor I was?
Well, I would guess it's a curveball. Okay. Because my guess was going to be dynamic.
Oh, I can't give you any hints. There's only 3 options, so I'm not giving you any hints, Rod.
But based on the context, it's probably cash flow.
Okay, these are all good. Okay, you're actually right the first one. I am a dynamic investor, but typically when I talk about my investor style, I talk about appreciation investing because I create a significant income. So I don't really need a lot of my investments. I'm not necessarily looking for cash flow, but what I've found in like real, like in real actuality, I find that I have a variety of all those things, which I actually feel pretty good about, right? At the end of the day, like there's a lot of value in the different types of investing, but I've also learned that long term, my business, it'll create cash flow long term as well, but it'll be nice to also have backup assets. So I've started to mix in more of the cash flow, just knowing that cash flow is, again, this is different because most of my cash flow is coming from the business, right? Mm-hmm. So like I have that and more than what I need or want I shouldn't say want, that's a silly, more than what I need. Everybody wants more money, right? But more than what I need. So like, that's not an issue, but I just found in real world application, I love cash flow still. Like it's still a part of my investment style.
Well, I think some of it goes back to what you said a minute ago, where when you combine this forward-looking goal of creating cash flow with the other goals that you have, saving on taxes, creating some appreciation, some safety, some liquidity, all those things. Well, when you combine all of those, and it'll go back to that equipment leasing one we mentioned a minute ago, you could say it's primarily for tax purposes, but it also is going to create a pretty nice cash flow with it as well. So
yeah. So in like cash flow, like really is king. From my perspective, there's just nothing better than knowing that I have income regardless of what's happening out there.
Yeah.
That's like genuine, real peace of mind. Okay. So finally, if you need help building some sort of a cash flow plan, all of our guys here at Money Insights, Rod, Brett, and Blake, any of our guys, they are more than happy to help you create a cash flow plan, give you ideas, that kind of thing. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.